The first speaker today is Marc Zender, obviously without whom Maya to Playa wouldn't be the same. Marc received his PhD from the Department of Anthropology and Archaeology of the University of Calgary. He has taught extensively on Maya and Mesoamerican topics and comparative historical linguistics worldwide. Marc is currently an assistant professor of anthropology at Tulane University in New Orleans, where he leads classes in linguistics, epigraphy, and Mesoamerican indigenous languages. Marc is the author of several books and dozens of academic articles exploring these subjects. He's also the project epigrapher for the Proyecto Arqueológico de Comalcalco in Tabasco, Mexico, and a member of the American Foreign Academic Research Project at Cajalpech in Belize. Marc's talk today explores the archaeological, iconographic, epigraphic, and linguistic evidence of a selection of Maya foodways, discussing their cultural and linguistic continuity. Marc will also explore the social settings for which various foods were considered appropriate, legacies of several periods of contact with Central Mexican culinary traditions, and transformations of the royal court and its cuisine in the wake of the classic Maya collapse. Marc's talk is titled Continuity and Change in Ancient Maya Foodways. Please welcome Marc Zender.
Thank you so much, Hari, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you to Hari and to Matt and to Max, of course, for the kind invitation to present to all of you today. It is a real pleasure to be here and talking about this fascinating topic. This conference is already off to a great start. I'm sure many of you will agree. Those of you who were lucky enough to tune in yesterday. And I'm really looking forward myself to the rest of the papers today and tomorrow and to the workshop on Sunday. I always enjoy Maya at the Playa, but this time the topic is one that's very near and dear to my heart. Some of you may have seen that a couple of years here at Tulane, we talked a little bit about Maya Foodways, Maya Fair, the conference was called. And some of these ideas that I'm going to present today came up there in a talk and also in the forum, in which I was also privileged to collaborate with Hari Kettinen and Carrie Hull, who'll be speaking to us here for this conference as well. It also builds upon ideas that I presented some years ago in a SAA conference that had been organized by Tracy Ardren. It has also evolved in several ways since then, as I hope you'll see. So without any further ado, let me jump in and talk about Maya foodways. And I think there's no better place to start with this kind of a topic than at the very beginning. This is actually the earliest depiction that we know of a Maya food. This is, of course, from the San Bartolo murals from the late preclassic period, sometime in the 2nd century BC, towards the end of that century. And we're already looking here at a bowl of laden tamales in this woman's hands as she kneels inside this monstrous cave. So more than 2,000 years ago, we're looking at this bowl of laden tamales. Pulling out here, we can see that it is the maize god himself, Hunishim, in his likeness of more than 2,000 years ago, who is receiving, of course, the first foods, or bringing the first foods out of the underworld cave and onto the surface world. First food, the first water. But whereas the water is depicted as being in a very naturalistic looking gourd, the foods are themselves already processed maize products, tamales too, the quintessential Maya bread, as we'll see moving forward. But first, a little bit more about this deity who ends up being central to Maya beliefs about food, the entire conception about where food comes from and what it means on a deep cultural level beyond simply being sustenance. Yes. Obviously, the maize god is well known from his depictions, particularly in what's often called the whole mold dancer motifs in vessels from Naranjo and other sites of the northeastern Petén. And this being was first identified as being, other than simply a young lord, which had been a nickname of him for a while, by Carl Taube in 1985 as being the classic version of the maize god. An earlier maize god, a different type actually, had been identified by Paul Schellhaas in the late 19th century, and he appears, this other deity, in the codices, in the post-classic codices. But this was the first recognition that this key figure, present on so many pots and dishes and plates and other realms of Maya art, was indeed the maize deity, the maize god. And the deity has a multiplicity of readings, something that I'll circle back to before the end today. Many of you may know that he's the head variant of the number 1. It's a mistaken idea that the head variant of the number 1 is a woman's head. The maize deity is a beautiful, a handsome god that shares some features with the glyph for a woman's head, including the marker on the cheek and what seems to be long hair, but here it's quite clearly depicted as being maize silk with jewelry in it, something the woman's portrait glyph never contains. Another value that this head carries in Maya writing is ishim, a reference to mais and grano, grain corn. And actually these two values, hun for one, ishim for grain, emerge from his own name. The personal name of the maize deity is hun ishim, right? Literally one maize. We typically call the maize god or the maize deity. Hunishim, of course, with its number in the name, is very reminiscent of the culture heroes and divinities in, for instance, the Quiche Maya Popol Vuh, and is evocative of that with its use of the number. Another value that the sign carries is the syllable na, which probably, although not certainly, derives from nal, mazorca, a mature ear of corn. I argued in 2014 for this separation visually between the maize god's head, the tonsured maize god is first identified by Carl, and its separation from the woman's head, and its use for all of these values. And I'll argue again before we finish today that the multiplicity of values for this sign emerges from its very centrality, the importance of maize to Maya diet and in Maya belief, and also the importance of this particular deity in mythological narratives, very, very central to Maya thought and Maya belief. Now, some years ago, in the late 1980s and 1990s, Michael Coe identified this figure in one of the central rondelles of this carved vessel from Dumbarton Oaks as being the cacao god. You can see that it's a youthful lord with several cacao pods sprouting from the body. He said specifically, in quoting here, a rare image of the cacao god of the classic Maya. His name appears in the vertical panel, but it cannot yet be read. And it was well taken in terms of clearly depicting an individual that was associated with cacao, but unexplained in Coe's discussion were the tree markings that it clearly carries on the body. And the fact that the portrait is part and parcel of what Carl Taube identified as the tonsured maize god. And this mystery was solved in the mid to late 2000s by Simon Martin, who was able to read this caption text that was unreadable in the 80s and 90s as Ubach Ishimte. Literally, it is the image of the maize tree. So in substitution for the first mystery, we had a new one, which is, why is this very, very clearly called a maize tree, and from the maize tree, cacao pods are growing. The deity also obligingly points towards a vessel that was clearly designed to house cacao or chocolate. And Simon Martin's paper, published in 2009, nicely details the pan-Mesoamerican myth, of course, of the deceased maize god and the underworld, from whose body grows not just chocolate, but all of the fruits, making the maize deity, right, Sinteotl among the Aztecs, far off in the west, and Hunishim among the Maya, far off in the east and the south, as the not just the god of maize, but the god of all foods and fruits, right? That they all stem literally from this one key being. And that solves for us the mystery of why so many chocolate pots drinking vessels like this one, excavated at Buena Vista del Cayo by Joe Tashak and Jennifer Ball in the 1990s, depicts what looks like the maize god dancing. Because of course the maize god is the source not just of corn and all of the products that derive from corn, as we'll see, but also the god that gave us chocolate and all of the other fruits, even the seasonings that would go into chocolate drinks and corn drinks like vanilla, cinnamon, and other things of that nature, all stem from this one ancient being. The text on these vessels, of course, typically calls out the origin of chocolate by saying things like Yukib ta ishimte el cacao, literally his cup for chocolate from the maize tree, with the vowel L suffix that indicates source or origin, ta ishimte el cacao. This could also be translated as his cup for maize tree-ish cacao, but the sense is that it emerges from the fabulous, magical tree that grows from the dead body of the maize god in the underworld and gives us all of these first fruits. Now, I wanted to highlight here the remarkable poster that we have this year. The Maya the Playa conference, for those of you who've been attending for years, or those of you even who've been watching from a distance, will know regularly features remarkable art. But I think that this particular year's poster is, just an amazing work of art by Walter Paz Hoch. I encourage all of you to go to the www.goafar.org website and navigate to the store and get yourself a copy of this amazing poster. And while you're there, go ahead and pick up a t-shirt as well. Not only is the art beautiful and evocative and very, very fitting for the theme, but I wanted to call attention to it here and in a couple of other places in my talk today, just because it features so many of the key categories of Maya foodstuffs that we're going to see, not just here in my talk, but also in, I'm sure, several of the talks through the weekend and even into the workshops on Sunday. So let me focus first on the Cacao Cup, which we've just talked about. Every single one of these is not only a beautiful work of art, here a chocolate cup with bubbles of frothy cacao coming out of the top, but also are completely legible. So the texts on them are very, very much in keeping with everything we know from the canons of classic Maya art and represent new examples of this ancient tradition. So chocolate from the maize tree is called out here. And then we even have a date for Etznab, and that relates to the date of the start of this conference yesterday, September the 23rd, 2021, for anyone who's curious as to why Walter placed this date on the chocolate cup. Of course, in another correlation, which is to say the Skidmore and Martin correlation, or Martin and Skidmore correlation, that's 3 days later than the typical GMT, this would be September 26th, which would fall on the Sunday, the last day of the conference. So it works perfectly for both. Maybe it's a cup of chocolate that'll keep for a couple more days. Now, what I wanted to do was talk about, chocolate, maize, and other related foodstuffs in the context where we actually see them being used. And for the classic Maya, that is, the examples are few and far between. We see many images of individuals eating and drinking on pottery, for instance, and we have a precious few mural scenes that seem to feature foods. But for monuments, it's very rare. And this is an exceedingly important context from the site of Piedras Negras from the middle of the 8th century that gives us not only a background history, political interactions between the local site and other sites of the vicinity, but a clear social contexts for the drinking and eating that are depicted here. And so this is a really great way to see in a privileged glimpse the largest number of actors that we have anywhere in Maya art associated with a scene of commensality, of eating and drinking. And so the individuals who are partaking in this rite are the local king, seated here on his throne, a foreign king and several other foreign diplomats and dignitaries who are visiting the throne of the king of Piedras Negras, the local king's heir, as well as the heir of one of his subordinates or lieutenants that are being supervised here under the watchful eyes of a local priest or a kuhun, and then lined up in front of the throne, but by the conventions of my art depicted as being in 2 rows, right? But really facing the king in real life are a whole series of individuals with local titles. So we have local lieutenants or sahals, ritual helpers or anabs, and even a prophet. And the two highest ranked of these individuals, the Bach Sahal or head Sahal and the Ti Sakhun or prophet, are understood to be closest to the king, with the others far away. Each of them have their names and titles associated with them down below. And then a very lengthy opening text gives us the date and several clauses that relate to this illustrated scene. So it's a very, very lengthy text in terms of describing what's going on in the associated scene. And so taking it in pieces here, we have this opening date on which Itzam Kanak, the divine lord of Piedras Negras, had his first katun in kingship. And then Sakhukub Yopatbalam, the divine lord of Yashchilan, called anciently Pachan, attended the ceremony. It says that here, Yilach, right? He saw it, he attended it. We get his name and his title right here. So that is the setting. We have Piedras Negras and its longtime rival and sometimes subordinate Yashchilan being present at this particular ceremony. And that sets up the political context in which this is happening. And that's the arrival then of this individual. We have to imagine that the affair that was being witnessed by the foreign king takes place over several days, because we're told that 2 days later, on the day 7 Tzikin, or 7 men, 18 Chen, we have the dance of the falling or descending Macaw that's done by the king. And so we have to imagine that these courtiers, visitors, other members from nearby and distant dynasties are watching the king do this. Very fittingly, he does the descending Macaw dance on the day 7 Eagle. And there's this nice juxtaposition of eagle and macaw that we see in many places in Maya and wider Mesoamerican art. And then that night of the day 7 Eagle, Itzam Kanak, the lord of Piedras Negras, drank of fermented chocolate, ukun tikal cacao. So he drank fermented chocolate. And that's what's happening in the scene. Not just him, by the way, although he's the star of each one of those passages, they focus on him. There's the implication that this foreign dignitary, who's of similar rank, although probably lesser than the local king of Piedras Negras, certainly in their own eyes, are the only ones called out in the main text. Many of our other monuments do this, of course. We have to wonder how many of them really refer to large group events like the one that's depicted here. Because in the scene, we not only have up here, sitting on the throne right beside the king, a tripod plate that would certainly have been stacked full of tamales, as we'll see, but we have one large lidded vessel that probably has the fermented chocolate in it, and one cup that's probably being passed around. And so it's being decanted and everybody is getting a sip of the fermented chocolate. So it's a real bringing together of different groups, a leveling of social ranks with the social lubricant of an actual fermented chocolate beverage, an alcoholic beverage. So this is a good segue for several points. We'll come back to talking about the tripod plates a little later, but let me talk about the drinks first. And in particular, let me call out the actual intoxicating beverages, the alcoholic beverages. So once more, with the help of Walter Paz-Ho's remarkable poster. If I didn't say it last time, go make sure to purchase yourself a copy of this poster before they go away. I understand they're only being sold in hard copy until early October. So time, perhaps supplies are limited. Here we have this beautiful image of what is a pulque vessel, which carries several remarkable artistic conventions and connotations. We're not to imagine that the Maya served pulque, right, or a fermented maguey beverage using agua miel collected from the hearts of maguey, fermented and turned into a kind of pre-Columbian tequila. We're not to imagine that they served them in these narrow neck vessels and that they also had maguey fronds there for decoration. This is a Maya convention for showing that the beverage inside is indeed made out of maguey, just as the glyphs on it are a textual indication of the same. Now, into the ethnographic present, in many parts of the Maya area, the cognates for the classic term chich for pulque refers to maguey in all of its uses. It refers to the plant, it refers to the thread made from the fibers of the maguey, the clothing made out of maguey, and even the intoxicating beverage. And to a large extent, the knowledge of how to do that to maguey and its usage had been lost in the Maya area, so much so that there'd been a supposition for a little while that the desert plant like the maguey or the century plant probably didn't even grow in the Maya area. That now seems to be manifestly untrue. Many related species still grow in the Maya area, and effectively the same climate regime that's needed to grow maguey, you can grow other cactus whose name is completely eluding me right now, from which one can make sisal or hemp fibers. And so it seems quite clear that this was present, and certainly all of the Maya languages have terms for this. Kich or chich are the two cognate terms. The image here has been pulled out of Maya art by Walter from a number of different scenes. Here's one of my favorites, a vessel from the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. We have one staggering drunk individual here who it's indicated has been imbibing chich or pulque. Another term for an ach chich or drunkard appears here. We have an individual holding up and bringing to the scene another narrow-necked jar containing pulque, although it looks like this fellow's probably had enough. And then down below here, we have that same convention we just saw with the maguey fronds literally out of the top, an artistic convention indicating what's inside this vessel at the same time that we have a textual convention for exactly the same thing. It seems as if more of the brew, the intoxicating brew, is being decanted here. We also have some monumental texts that refer to this. There's a great paper by Alexander Tocovanin that covers many of these pulque drinking scenes on pottery and also on carved texts from the site of Copan and a few other places. He mentions this one as well from the site of La Corona, where we have the local king who's said here to have drank and passed the pulque. Right. And so yakao is a verb that means to give by handing on, right, by sending along. So he passed along the pulque. Again, a good indication that the pulque is meant to be drank in order to break down social barriers between individuals of the same rank or even of vertical ranks in Maya communities. That's one of the useful features of alcoholic beverages, of course, and this is a clear indication that that's what's going on this one text from La Corona. We even have an actual cup. These are the remains of a stucco drinking cup. And I think it was first pointed out by David Stewart that the text here records Yukib Tachich, his cup for pulque. And here, instead of using the chi syllable, the hand that many of you recognize, there's another syllabic sign, which is in fact that skull with the maguey fronds coming off of it, a syllabic sign first recognized because of its substitution with the plain chi hand, but present here quite clearly. Potentially, it's also a logogram, chich for pulque, since that's what it depicts. But there's no doubt that there's many contexts in my art from this time that use it as just a syllable. So if so, then it's a syllable that originates from actually the word for maguey products specifically, and in this case, pulque proper. But we shouldn't slight maize beverages. And of course, we have to remember the maize god is that central deity, the deity of sustenance, we could think of him as, since he contributes not just corn, but also, of course, chocolate and many other fruits and seasonings. So in this remarkable scene, of course, from the painted pyramid at the Chiknab group at Calakmul, we have what is clearly an atole vendor, an achul, depicted here, serving the beverage. It looks quite brown in color, which might suggest that it's actually atole or ul with cacao inside it, or with other kinds of seasonings like cinnamon that might give it that color. And we have a cup here. This is an improvenance cup, unfortunately. We don't know where it came from originally, but it indicates that it is Yukib Ta'ul, his cup, for atole. It gives us the titles of an individual who's then said to be the Yahao or vassal of the great Lord Yuknom Chen, the Kalomte, the king of Calakmul during a great part of the 7th century. And intriguingly, the two ul spellings that we have actually on the painted pyramid at Calakmul have a very, very similar design and paleography for the lu sign. This very oversized, sort of feathered, finny, kind of hairy device that's inside the lu syllable, right? Probably indicating that this was painted at Calakmul itself, or perhaps a local sublord, or from a very, very similar scribal school. Now, atole and other maize beverages like pozole, for instance, are very widespread in the contemporary Maya ceremony and back into ethnohistoric documents as well, often mixed with or associated with alcoholic beverages. So for instance, here from Bruce Love's book about Maya shamanism, published in 2012, we have balche, 4 vessels of balche in each of the corners of this mesa, and then 9 cups of saka. Saka, or literally white beverage, is another term for a frothy maize beverage. That make 13 offerings altogether. And this is offerings that are made very, very frequently in field and forest to Maya gods and protectors of the milpa, like the Balams, for instance. And we have to remember that atole is a ritual drink, just as chocolate is. Both of them come from the body of the maize god culture hero. So imbibing them is very frequently a kind of a sacramental rite. And we know that in addition to being, tasty, they're also, of course, looked at with a degree of strong social and religious belief associated with them. You can see this, I think, very, very clearly in one of my absolute favorite vessels from classic Maya civilization, the Hummingbird Phase, which was excavated in the project in Tikal Burial 196. It's now on display in the Sylvanus Morley Museum at Tikal itself. It is very, very frequently, and I think quite correctly, referred to as an extraordinary work of art that can seem very unique, but it's a little less unique than it might seem at first blush. It's often referred to as if there are no other references to this kind of a scene. And we know that's not true. We'll see a little bit later on that the basic scene that's happening here is between god D, Itsam Kokach perhaps was his ancient name, in parley with the hummingbird. And there are many scenes of small animals, birds and other animals parlaying with this great god. Many of them, as I've written of with my colleague, my late colleague Andrea Stone, are just so stories talking about how animals receive some of their distinguishing characteristics by giving a gift of food or other offering to the great god and receiving something in return. As we'll see, it's the wings of the hummingbird that are being returned here. And also more specifically, we know of other examples of this scene. So of course, the Hummingbird vase comes from late in the reign of Yikni Chankawil at Tikal, so from the mid 8th century AD. But we can go back some 4 centuries to this beautiful mural from Sofrikaya, excavated by the project under Francisco Stradabelli, and here with the iconography recorded by Heather Hurst and the hieroglyphs in the middle part of the scene by Alex Tokovodin. And we're looking at substantially the same scene from 4 centuries earlier in the early classic period. We're looking at the great god, Itsam Kokach, with his large pectoral and large eye and other details that unerringly represent him. And he's talking with the hummingbird. And unfortunately, the text in between is terribly eroded. And there's not too much we can make out. There are a couple of signs that look like those, that are the same as signs that appear in the text. The spoken texts are actually on the hummingbird pot, suggesting that this might have been an earlier version of the same text, but there's no way to confirm that. And it may simply be that they star some of the same hieroglyphic signs in other roles, as it turns out. Now, if we move forward a couple of centuries to Copan, this comes from the reign of ruler 12. So about the middle of the 7th century, about 100 years before the hummingbird vessel. And this is one of 2 carved peccary skulls. The other one's very well known. This one wasn't really reassembled until the late 2000s. And I was fortunate to be there at the Peabody Museum as it was reassembled. This is Scott Fulton's photograph of the reassembled pieces of the second peccary skull. Here's just my drawing in the center here, where you can see that we're looking at the hummingbird's eye. You can see its feathers here from its arm and wings, and it's looking towards the old god, who's recognizable here largely by virtue of his tripartite pectoral that he's wearing, his large jade jewel. So it's ostensibly the same scene. And there are 4 hieroglyphs, 4 large hieroglyphic rondelles here, but unfortunately, they do not tell us anything about the scene. They merely say that this is the bone of the king of Copan, and the king carries 2 titles that we know ruler 12 carries on other monuments at this time period at Copan. So it's certainly him that's being spoken of. So if we want to understand what's going on in this specific scene between the hummingbird and the old god, we have to look at the hummingbird vase. And unfortunately, we don't have too many other glimpses of the scene. So I'm going to take the two scenes that you would see separately as you rotate the vase a little bit differently. And we have the opening scene here. In both cases, it's the hummingbird squared off against the king. And so here we're looking at the hummingbird almost seeming to feel under his arm. It's probably a gesture of respect to the god, but it's also as if, you know, he's recognizing that he has an unfortunate lack of feathers. So he's looking over at the god, and the god is gesturing ma, or no, very, very common gesture in Maya art. It's a gesture of hesitation or stopping. We can't read all of the gestures in Maya art, but those that are associated with writing or appear frequently, we have a bit more luck with. And if we look at the text that's here, we have a lot of success in reading the individual signs here across the board, but it's a very unique passage. There's several ways that we could parse it, and we have a little bit of a difficulty in parsing spoken texts anyway. So what I'm offering here is just one of several possible ways to read this. You can notice, for those of you that do glyphs, that there's several possessives in a row here, u and ya and yo. So whether these are meant to be nested possessives or all separate, right, and in parallel is a choice that presumably the ancient audience would have recognized very well. But we're left with several possibilities. It seems pretty clear that the hummingbird is extolling the virtues of chach or pinole in some way here, right? Pinole is the earth uncovering, perhaps, although pas is also a root that means dawn. So perhaps it's referring to dawn. The awakening, perhaps. I'll be interested to see the workshop on Sunday, because I know Albert and Daria have some thoughts about this particular root, yach, and other contexts that refer to, for instance, breakfast and breakage. And then the entering of the sun. Pinole is the earth uncovering, the awakening, the entering of the sun. Most of these poetic passages, if that's what this is, you should be skeptical of their readings. We don't have enough other parallels to be 100% sure of what it is that the hummingbird has said to Itsam Kokach here. The next scene is a little bit better with some elements that are a lot clearer. So for instance, here we can see that the god's gesture has changed from one of stopping to one of presentation. This is the same as the yet hand, which means to present or to give. And it seems as if what he's given is wings. The hummingbird now has wings. And what did he give the god in exchange for the wings? Well, a couple of things. We're looking at a big pile of feathers here in a basket, a woven basket. And we're also looking at a narrow neck vessel that has the logogram sa on it. And sa is a term that has several different meanings in closely related Cholan Seltalan languages. Because of that, Kaufman and Norman reconstruct its meaning back to Proto-Cholan as not specifically posol, which it means in some languages, or atole, which it means in others, or even masa or corndo, which it can mean in a large number of different Mayan languages, but rather all of them. That is to say, it's not very clear yet whether it is specified or narrowed in its meaning. So this could well be the posol that's being talked about out in front of the god as a gift. And indeed, once more, we see chach being talked about. And again, there's several ways to read this. Again, the individual signs aren't the difficulty. The question is whether what's clearly a negative, ma, is negating a noun or is negating, say, an imperative verb with this as its direct object with a new sentence beginning, or whether all of this runs together and we're looking at a negated adjective on a noun phrase, right? But once we get to awichnal wahwal, it starts to become pretty clear. So something like unending heavenly pinole is before you, my lord, is one possibility. Another possibility is if chan isn't an adjective, but is in fact skies or heavens, then it might be something like don't destroy, don't end the heavens, right? Pinole is in front of you, my lord, which is just to say that we don't have an easy way of choosing between different possible options, right? Several people have been working on these texts for a while. I should mention some of my colleagues, particularly David Stewart, who first parsed the yichnal and awichnal spellings in this and other contexts to indicate something being before or in front of, right? These are very, very common phrases in Maya writing. We have a first person possessive here. A number of my colleagues, Carrie Hall, Michael Carrasco, and Danny Law and others have been working on these pronouns and possessives in these contexts. But it seems pretty clear that pinole is an offering that the hummingbird is made to the god in exchange for his wings, and is therefore considered to be a reasonable or good offering to give a deity, right? And we'll see that tamales fit into that same particular role. We often see them in court scenes like this one from a pot. They're much rarer in monumental court scenes, but that's because they are much, much rarer in general than they are on pottery. We've got a big heaping bowl of chocolate here, and it's time to turn to these deep dishes that actually have very often tripod feet, but not always, that carry these balls of maize dough, very often with sprinklings or seasonings on top of them. Now, those of you who are familiar with Mexican cuisine, of course, are familiar that tortillas are a staple, widespread across Mesoamerica, but there are no tortillas in classic Maya art. Tortillas don't even enter into the Maya area, it seems, until the terminal classic at the earliest, the early post-classic, in many places in this particular part of the world. And they enter because of Mexican influence attendant to the grim years at the end of the late Classic and the Classic Maya collapse, when a lot of things changed, including, of course, the straightforward or the most common way to prepare breads out of corn. Many of you know that tortillas have their origin and the lengthy history in the western part of Mesoamerica, particularly highland Mexico. And you can see here from the Mendoza Codex that a girl at the age of 13, here we go, 13 años, is expected to be able to grind corn and make tortillas on a comale. And this is something that archaeologists have noticed for a long time, is that these comales, the tortilla griddles, that are such a hallmark part of the preparation of tortillas, corn ground into meal and turned into tortillas on a comale and fried on them, right? These are not found in fragments. There are no clay comales or any other comales found in the Maya area through much of the pre-classic, none of the pre-classic, early classic, and into the late classic, which is when we first start to see them. And this works very, very well with the word for the comale griddle as well, which is samecht or semecht in many Mayan languages of the lowlands. That is clearly has the hallmarks of being a late borrowing from the 9th century or later, because it hasn't undergone the characteristic sound changes that it would have undergone if it had been a native Maya word, not borrowed into the region. And this is something that was first argued, I think very convincingly, by John Justison and his colleagues Terry Kaufman, William Norman, and forgetting Thomas Smith Stark back in the 1980s. So we've known this for a while. And it's pretty clear that then tamales, as we saw in the image from San Bartolo, is the quintessential early Maya bread, and a sacred bread whose usage continued in Maya ceremony, even as it was phased out on a quotidian level in favor of tortillas, which entered in. And so sacred breads in Maya ceremony, like the ceremony from northern Yucatan, a chachak ceremony, here in a photograph by Carl Taube, are nohuach. Literally, because the term huach, as we'll see, originally meant tamale, but it meant generally bread. When tortilla came in as the daily basic bread, it took over that name in a lot of Mayan languages. Others used the term pa for the tortilla. But those that took wach to mean tortilla now needed a way to talk about, big chunky breads like tamales, and nohuach became that label. We can see here several stages in the preparation of nohuach, again from Bruce Love's book on Maya shamanism, with the yichilhuach, the eyes of the bread pressed into the final layer, balche going into each eye, the holes plugged with sikil paste, right, made with pumpkin or squash seeds, and then the nohuach wrapped for baking, and then baking, of course, in earth ovens, right? So here's a whole pile of nohuach baking inside a peeb or earth oven before the final layer of earth goes on top of them. And these are the quintessential offerings. Not only are they the first and the most widespread, indeed the only, bread stuff depicted in classic Maya art, but they're the offerings par excellence. So just as the hummingbird gives to God D in the heavens, pinole, here the deer are bringing him dishes stacked with tamales, right? And they climb up into the heavens. Beautiful image here of the sky band twisted into being both a throne and a set of stairs for the deer to ascend. And in exchange for giving these tamales, they receive their antlers, right? So they get antlers in exchange for the tamales. How do deer get their antlers? Why? They gave tamales to the great god of the sky, of course. How else, right? A quintessential and hallmark offering then for the god of the sky. And these types of plates that we've seen with tripod feet or without, we actually find glyphically marked, as I recognized more than 20 years ago now, in this vessel from the Gardner Museum in Toronto, with a label that refers to plates or dishes. But etymologically, the term really means we'ib. We is the term that means to eat tamales. In fact, the logogram shows a stylized human mouth with a tamale in it, right? With an instrumental suffix. So we could say that his dish etymologically means his thing for eating tamales. And one fascinating feature here, to speak about ethnolinguistics for just a moment, of Mayan languages, is that Mayan languages have separate terms for different kinds of eating. So you can see that Kaufman and Norman have reconstructed here back to Proto-Cholan times a word for wet, meaning to eat, and another one, kush, meaning to eat. And if we look at the modern languages, we can see that the reason for two different verbs referring to eating are because they came originally from different semantic territory, and sometimes the semantics of the terms changed over time. So Chol has a word kush that means to eat nuts or toasted tortillas, and not other kinds of things. Muk is the term that was reserved for eating soft things. Similarly, Chorti, another Cholan language, has Macaw, a cognate of this muk in Chol, that means to eat soft things as well. So we could say muk back in Proto-Cholan times, since we have both a Western and an Eastern Cholan cognate, would have been another verb, meaning to eat soft things. Tzotzil, which is a Cholan Seltalan language, has lo as a verb for eating fruit, ti as a verb for eating meat, or very proteinaceous things, and we for eating tortillas and bread, a cognate with the we that we see here. So eating tamales or tortillas or bread seems to be the basic sense of we. Kush would have been things like nuts or grainy contiguous things, and then muk to eat soft things. And we even see muk in the Dresden Codex. So the preferential verb for the eating of tamales, for instance, in the Dresden Codex, you can see each of these gods is holding a tamale, is the verb mak, right? So we has passed away, particularly here in the north, which is recording a different idiom, as in fact recording a diglossic situation between, it seems, Eastern Cholan and even a kind of nascent Eastern Yucatecan, or at least a Proto-Yucatecan phase of the language recorded here in these documents. So to return to the plate for a moment, not only do we have the nice image of the glyph and the fact that we know that we means primarily to eat breads rather than to eat other kinds of things, but the text goes on to tell us that this is his plate for sak chichil wach, right? For white tamales of the deer, right? For white venison tamales. So quite specifically, these are meant to be tamales with deer meat inside them. And of course, that brings us once more to the, I think for the last time here, to the beautiful poster for this year's conference, right? And it won't have escaped your notice that we have a beautiful deep dish at the top, which carries several tamales. And so the plate is not only marked in perfectly legible Mayan as uweib ta, right? Presumably the text would have continued around the circumference of the vessel, so we don't get to see it all, right? So it is his dish for, but we don't need to be told what it's for because it's actually illustrated for us. It's not just for tamales, it's apparently for fish tamales, for deer tamales, and for turkey tamales, right? So just beautiful art, but taking its license from canons that we have, from classic images and discussions of the importance and centrality of the tamale, and indeed of the different kinds of tamales or the different kinds of meats that were added to tamales. So with respect to fish tamales, we see them as key offerings in the New Year's pages. So that's what we're looking at here. We have God offering a beheaded turkey, human hearts, offerings of incense, and then down here, we focus on this for a moment, we're looking at a deep dish with tamales that are marked as being fish tamales inside them. In another page of the codex, we actually have fish spelled out syllabically in Yucatecan idiom as kaiwach, fish tamales, explicitly called out. We have deer tamales in a few places. I think most evocatively here in a couple of pages from the Madrid Codex, which I think were first really nicely described by Victoria Bricker many years ago as being basically pages full of offerings made on Hallmark days. So you can see here that we have 1 imish and the offerings lined up below, 2 ik, 3 akbal, and then what would be the day for kan, which is itself the day for maize, right? Kanan, right? We actually have deer tamales. How many? 97 of them are called out here. So we have 4 20s, and 17 being called out. The weird order of having the number after the offering is because this is a tally or a list. It's not meant to be linguistic. Again, something that was, I think, first pointed out, at least as far as I know, by Victoria Bricker. Now we also have turkey tamales, and this is where the inspiration of the image on the poster, of course. So we have the dish again, really, really large tamale with a turkey head poking out of it. There's no doubt that's a turkey rather than some other kind of bird, of course, because in the Madrid Codex, we have a turkey with the same snood covering over its bill, the caruncles here up on top of its head, and called out in the text, as was first recognized by Yuri Knorosov back in the 1950s, is the syllabic spelling kutsu for kuts, turkey. And indeed, elsewhere in the Dresden Codex, we have glyphically called out kutzwach, as well as another offering fit for a particular kind of day in one of the almanacs, right? We also get iguana tamales, right? So that doesn't show up on the poster, but these have a multiplicity of different depictions in the Madrid Codex as well, which I'm not showing here, but we're looking at the more glyphic kind of depiction of an iguana. Well, for instance, we have two hieroglyphs that depict an iguana, the syllable hu and the logogram sich, both representing different species of iguana, emerging, from a hole. And here the hole they emerge from is actually the tamale. So we're looking at an iguana tamale, but we can also have the iguana with all of its spikes and its striped body. Chances are you've seen these kinds of iguanas if you've ever visited sites in northern Yucatan, draped over a tamale. Here another image of the same thing, although it doesn't have the back spikes, and then a syllabic spelling with the syllable hu spelling out the term. We even sometimes get tamales in the Madrid Codex marked with just the spikes from the back of the iguana in kind of a visual conflation. So iguana meat also a key part of the tamale diet. Now we have some very quotidian, right? Even mercantile, we could say, depictions of the use and ingestion of tamales, not just the sacred domain of offerings to the gods, right? Both in mythology, animals offering things to the gods, explaining where they got their unique characteristics, and humans offering things to the god, which carries into modern nohwach ceremonies, of course. But to return to the market murals of the painted pyramid in the Cheeknob complex at Calakmul, here on the upper tier, we can see a scene of, again, a tamalera, right, a tamale vendor, literally vending or selling tamales in a market scene. This was first recognized by Simon Martin. So we're looking here at very, very large tamales. And if I zoom in on this scene a little bit, we can actually see, that the tamales in the art are depicted just like the tamale sign, right? We'll come back to that observation in just a moment. And then, of course, cut up and a little bit more realistic into bite-sized morsels that this person is ingesting. So a fresh tamale from a tamale vendor right inside the market. We also have other references to maize products, not tamales proper, but to masa itself, sold with several kinds of other seasonings. Rather than meat being put into a tamale and baked, we can have masa itself with things like annatto and sikil, right, or pumpkin, or squash seeds, right? And that seems to be what's going on in this scene, again, as Simon Martin recognized. We have a rather unique spelling, a usage of the logogram kuch, just for its sound value in the middle of a word that's probably kumal, although not impossibly something like kuchmil, but kuchmal seems much more likely. And what we're looking at here is something that seems like a ball of maize, though, albeit with a red circle and an individual holding one of these elements. And so we have the corn dough, the kuchmal vendor here. It's important to recognize, by the way, that this construction of putting an agentive, ach, in front of these terms for products, right, or foods, or any noun in point of fact, produces actually an occupation term in Mayan languages. So bu'ur is bean, but ach bu'ur isn't just one of the beans or he of beans or she of beans, but a bean seller, as we know from the modern languages. Ach hishim is a maize seller. Ach si is a firewood cutter. That is, his occupation might be making firewood or selling firewood. And of course, in many markets across Mesoamerica, that would be the same person, harvesting the firewood, bundling it up, bringing it to the market to sell, right? We know this type of construction, of course, from things like ach tzib, which isn't, writing person, painting person, but one who writes, right? One who produces writing, right? An ach shurak, cutter of hay or grass. An ach shurak is a hay seller in the markets. So that's what's going on with ach kuchmal, right? And we have the Chorti Cognate, pretty much identical to the form we see on the painted pyramid, except that an L has become an R, as is consistent in the Chorti language. And notice Cary Hull's gloss for his Chorti dictionary, a special dough for making tamales. So this is the masa, right, that's used to make tamales, but kohmar is the stage where, prior to it being baked and being used for other things, for instance, making pozole or selling by itself or tinting. In fact, there's a sample sentence that he gives us that means the woman makes tamale dough tinted with anato. So kohmar, right, tinted with anato, right, or achiote. And that seems to be, this could be a gloss, this sentence, for the image that we see from the painted pyramid, which is really kind of great. Right? So another usage of the all-important maize product. Now, I mentioned this kind of interesting feature where the hieroglyph, which we've long thought represents a ball of maize dough. This was first recognized in a paper in 1989 by Carl Taube, and at the same time in a paper by Bruce Love, published in Word and Image in Maya Culture in 1989. So these two scholars independently recognized that they were looking at sacred breads, one from a predominantly iconographic perspective and the other one with respect to the continuity of that tradition into modern northern Yucatan. It also has a marker of shininess on it because, of course, masa is a little bit slick, it's a little bit wet, it's a little bit shiny, and it has what seems to be iconographically a leaf wrapped around it, which is fairly typical of the way tamales are wrapped, of course, for baking, right? So that's the hieroglyph, which certainly has some changes over time. But what's remarkable, as I pointed out, is that in the scene, two tamales sitting, right, on a plate actually look like the hieroglyphs, right? Whereas in other contexts, the masa simply looks like it would in real life, a little bit yellowish, and then with the red anato inside it. So we can see that we move from a pretty realistic depiction, right, in the pre-classic period. This is that image of heaped tamales inside a bowl. Not as many conventions, certainly not the conventions of late classic Maya art, right? Much more realistic depictions, albeit with conventions of their own in late pre-classic art, where we're looking at the bowl, and inside it we can see, you know, the finger pressed hole, the ichil wach, right? And then we're looking at the little droplets of flavorings, rather seasonings, that are on the tamales. And if we move into many classic depictions of tamales, I've shown you one before with the seasonings and sauces on it. Here, two others from other late classic Maya vessels. We have very, very realistic depictions of tamales throughout. In the codices is where we see actual art, right, that looks like hieroglyphic signs, right? So somewhere between the late classic period and the post-classic period, we actually have the tamale sign invading art and becoming a way that you depict tamales, right? And I think the earliest examples cluster around the time of the Calakmul murals, right? So we're looking at here the long reign of Yuknum Chen in the 7th century as being the timing when that artistic convention kind of happens, right? So just an interesting moment, a snapshot in the history of that word. Other things to talk about for the Tamale Glyph, right, which emerges out of this group of different depictions of things like tamales proper, of things like masa itself, whether serving as the source for pozole or being eaten the way it is the glyph in question, T506, here in a carved version, and a painted version has just as many different readings as the maize god's head does in Maya writing. Almost certainly a reflection of its importance, its cultural importance and salience, and its the variegation of the context in which it appears in Maya culture and in Maya art. So we know it has the value ohl, which I would argue refers to the ball of maize dough itself, right? The masa, right? Rolled into a ball, right? Or circled into a ball. Ohl or wohol in Mayan languages refers to a round shape, not necessarily something rolled from flat into round necessarily. We know it has this value because of substitutions in the script. And in fact, it's very frequent, but usually not to refer to a ball of maize dough, although that's the term in the languages. It usually refers to the synonym all heart. So that, for instance, we find in these glyphic collocations from Tikal, explained by Dmitry Belyaev, kup ol achin, and the larger formula kup yol achin, the cut heart of the crocodile, right? Cut is the heart of the crocodilian as a name, a remarkable name. We also, of course, have wah as a value. We see this in many places, as we've just seen, ahwah, the tamalera, the tamale vendor, right? And fascinatingly, the logogram wah is part of a family of signs in Maya writing with final J's and H's that lose those over time as sound changes happen in the early 8th century or are first recognized and respected in the inscriptions in the early 8th century. And signs like, for instance, start to be used as just as a syllable. Signs like tah for torch start to be used just as syllabic ta. And that is also true of the wah logogram that had previously been tamale as a word sign. It starts after about the middle of the 8th century, right? Or at least that's the earliest example we have. Perhaps it begins a little earlier like some other signs do, right? To be used just for syllabic wa, right? So here are, excuse me, just 6 examples of that, where we have a panel from alluded panel published by Meyer in the late 1980s, which actually has ni chab, wakbal, right? And we actually have wa ka ba la as the first person possessed form of the word akab with its abstract derivation on it, right? So the wach tamale simply uses the syllable wa. Here is an inflection of the verb Macaw. He covered it, he sealed it, where wa again has to be just the syllable. Here as a wa in chumwani tiahalel at yashchilan. Here again as providing the ending of uchoko, right? Sorry, uhocho kak. He drilled fire. And here probably providing, as my colleague Christoph Helmke has suggested, the number 8, washak, in the inscriptions of Nachtunich. So not terribly common. These probably are the only 5 examples. I think that's still true that we have. And all of them, as you can see, from after 750 broadly, and that might have started earlier as some other spellings undergo that change and enter the syllabary, but a remarkable group of changes for the sign. And finally, it must be the 4th day sign as well, which probably has a value like kan, or to look at Tsaltalan languages, kanan, which refers to something ripe, something toasted. And that makes a lot of sense, particularly when we compare it to what's going on with the maize god's head. I should have said at the outset, and I didn't, that the maize deity with its number of different values, 3 different values, and now the tamale sign with 3 different values in the script, right, is not a common feature. In fact, most signs in Maya hieroglyphic writing do not have multiple values. There are a few signs, a handful of signs that have 2 different values, sometimes a logogram and a syllable, and a very small number of signs indeed, right? Probably 6 or so that have 3 values like these do. The famous kawak sign, which is of course tun and ku, and something like chahuk or kawak is another one, right? But they're few and far between, and they seem to refer to very culturally salient ideas like the storm god Chak and storms and so on. And here to maize, right? No surprise at all, given that the maize god is the source of all of these foods that we've looked at. And so, of course, in paying homage to the maize god, it makes perfect sense that just as human beings offer one of the most sacred substances that they can to their ancestors and the gods, their own blood, it would make sense that they would also offer, right, the blood and the body of their maize deity, their god of sustenance, who provided all of the types of sustenance that we've seen, with the sole exception of maguey, which seems to come from Western Mexico and have its own mythological origin. Every one of the foodstuffs and the beverages that I've looked at today comes from this great culture hero and deity, and its continuation, particularly within modern Maya culture and across Mesoamerica, speaks really well to the preservation of this sacred ideal of the origin of maize. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Excellent talk, as always. We are already over time, but we can maybe have a couple of short questions and comments. There is one by Rick. What is the ring around the hummingbird beak?
Yes, that's a great question, Rick. It's a flower. We know that from its iconography. In other contexts, that exact same image, the ring with the little tiny horizontal slashes, top and bottom, appears in the Maya script as the word for neek, flower. And so it's on the bill of the hummingbird to tell you that this is the kind of bird that eats flowers. So it's an iconographic convention. This is the bird, of course, that sucks the nectar out of flowers.
And there are a couple of questions that are more to the organizers, so I can answer those, or
Sure.
Mac or Matt. One comment that I have for the Mark, I agree that ul on the Kalakmul mural is probably chocolatey atoll. However, cinnamon, as you mentioned, is from East Asia, so that couldn't be the color.
That's a good
so
point.
Maybe,
yeah.
maybe cacao or ground maize or some other local ingredient, or just artistic representation. So this is, of course, the possibilities.
Yeah, I should have said
Maxim,
cinnamon, of course, is really common in atole and pozole drinks across the area
it is
today, but it's a
yes.
later introduction. Yeah.
And kind of a off the topic question from Maxim asking about Pari Journal. So the last issue came out early this year. So he's asking about the future of the Pari Journal.
Oh yes, yeah. There have been delays in the production process, largely on my side because of COVID-related issues, and then of course also very, very recently the complete shutdown of New Orleans, really, for going on almost 3 weeks now because of Hurricane Ida. So the issues will be coming in short order, and look for them. We've got some great articles in the queue.
Perfect. And if there are any other questions, I'm sure that we can, Mark can answer those later today or this week. So you can still use the Q&A or the chat, and we can definitely address those issues.
Yeah,
later.
I'll monitor the chat now, and I'll be happy to answer anything in there as we go.
Perfect. Thank you, Mark.
Absolutely.